This week, we really look at the core of quantitative research, and that is the use of descriptive statistics to study the problems of practice. Oftentimes, the basic data that we gather and the descriptive statistics that we calculate are what give us a picture of what's going on. And we may take that data and interpret it a little bit further in inferential statistics, which we'll talk about as the course progresses. But this is really at the core of quantitative studies, looking at numbers and trying to interpret them as they may be showing us some sort of picture of what's going on to hopefully inform our practice. So like always at the beginning of the chapter, there's the problems of practice. They give you 5 this week, and it's hopefully to get you thinking about some of the current types of things going on in education. This week they put these 5 out, and I think as you read through each one of these, you can say, yes, I've heard a statistic about that. For example, is the number of homeless children and youth sufficiently large to be a matter of serious concern? You've probably heard the percent of homeless children, and if we Googled it right now, we even looked for the year, we could find them in each state and in the nation. What can be done about the persistent achievement gap between Hispanic and white students? They give you a chart in your text, and actually I'm a little disappointed that it's not updated. This is the 7th edition. It just barely came out, and when I was looking at text, I said, well, gee, we can't even get enough of the 6th edition. Hopefully they'll have updated all the statistics in here. And in fact, I've gone out and been able to find that, and I was thinking of having you guys do it too, so you got that practice, but there's just a lot of content. So I think you understand that we can Google just about anything and find that. But they do show you this gap, and it is designed to give you some sort of picture, but it's subject to interpretation. Are teacher salaries adequate for the contribution they make to society? This is somewhat of an evaluative question, but we can actually look at what teacher salaries are, and in fact, that's the theme that they take in this chapter, and pretty much uses the example for the entire chapter as they present different terminology and descriptive statistics. Again, I wish they had put a little bit more current data in there. Seems like they could have done it, but these books go to press a little early. And I give you some new tables and charts in the discussion that you can actually use as you present what you see going on and interpret the patterns that you see in teacher salaries. The 4th one, what type of educational technology will prove to be the most useful? Well, that's kind of interesting. That's more predictive. That's like how are we gonna know what that really looks like? So I'm on that one, and this last one, how do we encourage teachers to make use of educational technology? You'd have to say to yourself, what descriptive statistic could we gather? And that might be, in the case of the 4th bullet there, what educational technologies are being used most often and so forth. Recently on the ASTE Smart Brief, of which I talked about during week 1, there was a post that just went out, and it said that Chromebooks now are taking the lead. They've actually now gone beyond Apple products in the classroom, and now Chromebooks are actually the most popular thing. I don't remember the statistic, but if you saw something like that, you might say, well, a Chromebook, something that connects you to Google and has all these Google Docs and free resources, are something that might prove the most useful, although it's pretty early on to say that. The last one, again, is about how we make use of the educational technologies, and that might just be a descriptive study about which technologies are being used most currently, and perhaps we would see those and look at a measurement as to which ones really impact teaching or impact learning. And so the last 2, I think, they're a little bit more of a stretch, but all of them, when you have the statistics for any of these categories, you are going to still need to be able to interpret what those numbers are telling you. And I give you a little way to practice that, if you will, in the discussion this week. Some important ideas. There are 12. As we've been going through, I highlight and talk about these a little bit each week. These are the takeaways. I put the objectives, and they're kind of broad strokes, because I also don't want to have a really long page, and your chapter does a really good job of saying this is what you should look for. But my objectives for the week are really condensed down into a couple of main things, and primarily, if you understand the terminology, you're halfway there. But a couple of things to pay attention here. 2 is the quantitative data plays an important role in improving educational practice. At least that's the way it appears. I don't know if there's any super good data that quantitative data has actually made that difference, but it helps us to make decisions. And in fact, decision makers, policy makers, legislators, State boards of education, school boards, local school boards, they want quantitative numbers to help them make decisions with public money. So that's not new to you. You see it all the time. The descriptive terms that we talk about this week are the kinds of things that are discussed in those kinds of meetings. The second item here talks about, is it possible to have different measures for the same construct? Yes, and it gives you some really good examples. And in fact, this chapter goes on a little bit more about constructs. In fact, your whole text talks about how this is really important, how a construct can represent a variable of a group of things, as we learned clear back in, I think, chapter 3 or 4. Fourth one here, quantitative research and statistical analysis are largely about the study of variations between individuals and the important characteristics and achievements. That is a really important takeaway. That's what we're looking for. We're looking to find the variation. And those variations help us to inform us to make changes, to provide interventions, to do things to hopefully increase achievement. So that's really what they're all about. But I could also maybe plug in the word here. Qualitative research is about the study of variations, because even narrative research will tell us about how individuals vary. It just doesn't give us those really important things, those achievement numbers that the quantitative folks that we've already discussed with the make the decisions. It doesn't give them those hard numbers to kind of play with and move around on the continuum as they look at salaries and priorities for spending in education. 5, the nominal scales. These are all the different ways we scale things and how we score things to get the data. So that's an important concept, or all of that terminology. A couple of pages on the differences for how we have scales. It's real important. I ask you on the quiz to look these up. And quite honestly, that's what those quizzes are about. Quizzes are kind of review of the chapter. Did I get it? And I make them open notes so that you don't have to memorize it and hopefully get a great score. Honestly, if you look it up, it really just tests your understanding. And if you miss some on the quiz, then you can go back and check it out and hopefully learn from those quizzes. And that's why they're pretty small. They're not the giant percentage in the class, but they are open note and they are designed to be learning experiences. 7 talks about mean, median, and mode. Those are very familiar terms. If you haven't had a stats class recently, you still should be familiar with these terms because they're used all the time in education, especially when we look at test scores. And for the most part, as your chapter discusses, we are looking at the mean or the average of those kinds of scores. Standard deviation. I know that this is a term that's familiar to all of you. We talk about it with the quizzes, but standard deviation and how it's calculated, as this chapter discusses it, I think it gives you a better picture as to why it's very useful to us as we start to discuss the differences or the variation that we're seeing in the scores. Another number 9 on standard deviation units and what those mean. In fact, I think there's some clarification that needs to be made on the normal curve, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. 10, distribution of the set of scores can be displayed graphically. You've all done charts and graphs. You've maybe even worked with your students on charts and graphs, but here they talk about the differences and when it would be appropriate to use histograms, bar graphs, and pie charts. And in fact, I actually created a lesson on one of the ag lessons in the college and career awareness courses, is working with kids to take ag data and use the appropriate graph. So for some of you who are in the college and career awareness, you may say, oh yeah, I remember that lesson. It's helpful in this class. Number 12, researchers increasingly favor the use of correlational analysis because it provides more of a mathematically precise representation than the strength of a relationship between 2 or more scores. And correlation is really just, are things related? And they have a chart and a graph in the back. And I almost talked about that today, but I figured, you know what, we have a whole chapter on correlation. So this is really just an introduction to tell you about how they look at relationships between variables and find those differences. So those are the important ideas. Key terms, I actually went through these and I thought, oh, this is important, this is important, this is important. Maybe I'll mark the ones that aren't important. None are marked. These are all really important terms that you should be quite familiar with. They are almost in any kind of research that you pick up, they're going to be talked about, or you're going to have the different visuals, a scatter plot, or you're going to have, some of these pie charts and things like that. So all of these terms, none really rank above any of the others. Like some weeks I highlight some are more important than the others. This week, all of these terms, and in fact, well, Excel is a program that most of you are probably aware of, but all of these are very important descriptive terms. Teacher salaries are used as examples in the text to discuss all of these terms, and so it keeps that same example all the way through. Now, there are two things I want to talk about that I think your chapter could have done a better job explaining. If you totally understood the section on variance, then you don't need to listen to this part. But this is actually a direct quote from your text. Let me see if I can explain it a little bit. On variance on page 154, it says, the variance is another measure of the variability of scores around the mean. So we have the mean and how the scores are varying around it. It sometimes is calculated as part of the statistical analysis. Yes, oftentimes at the bottom of a table or chart, we'll see a variance, an S score. The variance is simply the sum of squares divided by the sample size minus 1. And that's n minus 1, so sample little n minus 1. In other words, it is the average of the squared deviations from the mean. If the data is to be analyzed represents the entire population, the equation stated above is modified slightly. The sum of squares is divided by the population size. In this case, if you had 50 states, and there are only 50 states, it is not necessary to subtract 1 from 50. Now, one of the things they left out was, why did you subtract 1 to begin with? And so when we're looking at a sample size and we are taking a sample rather than we know the entire population, like right here we know 50 states, and so that's all there is. We're just going to divide by those 50 states. And they include the Commonwealths in there too as part of the 50. But when our sample is a little nebulous, like we have somewhere around 4,582 students, but some moved, some left and went to this district or that district, they moved around, maybe that really wasn't the number. When we are just pulling a sample size so that we can err on the side of conservatism, we do the sample size minus 1, and that statistically gives us a more conservative number. They left that part out. This is called, for those of you who've had a stats class, the degree of freedom. That means that we're just adjusting the sample size to be conservative in our estimate. I don't know why they didn't talk about that. I can't remember if they talk about it as we move forward, but I think this is the only chapter where they talk about variance, so I wanted to add that point of clarification. Oh, also in the videos I provide this week, that is talked about just a little bit more to give you a little more understanding. The other item I want to talk about is the normal curve, and this should be somewhat reviewed because we always talk about, are you grading on a curve? And the problem is that now that we have so many statistical packages and we can even use Excel and so forth, and things are pretty automated, we just crunch the numbers, we just input the numbers, poof, it comes out, and we're like, whew, I'm glad that's there. I can report this to students' parents and to my administration and so forth. But here you need to be able to understand it, especially as you read research. You're like, where's that percentile rank? And we will come back to some of this. Some of this might be new vocabulary, but this normal curve is something that's used all the time in education and all the time in descriptive statistics. So this is the normal curve, and 0 is right here. These marks move out are standard deviations from the mean. So the mean would be right here. So whatever the average is right here. Now I've copied the text exactly from your book. I can't remember what page that's on, but it's under the section on normal curves. But for example, if an individual scored one standard deviation unit above the mean, which is right here, 0, it indicates that he or she obtained a score of 41. That is 34.15 plus 7.32. And you're like, wait a minute. If you remember correctly in that particular section, they tell you that the mean on that particular score or test or whatever it was 34.15. And so right here in the middle, that score, if I could write it down right here, 34.15. If you do the Khan Academy videos, he has some really cool thing here, and probably I could look for a tool. But if you just look here where my cursor is, that's where the average is. And the standard deviation for this example was calculated at 7.32. And so if a person is one standard deviation above the mean, it's simply taking the mean plus the standard deviation, and that gives you their score, rounded to the whole number of 41. So somebody who is one standard deviation on that particular distribution of scores that they gave you has a score of 41.47. Now, the other thing that they kind of talk briefly about here is what that means in terms of the of the sample. And notice that it's divided into 6, not quite 6, but close to 6 different segments. And so when you move this side or this side, we're looking at about 33, 34 parts of that particular curve. And so here's 68. So if we're 1.5, 1.5, we're looking at adding these sections, and that put together gives us the 68th percent of the sample. And 68%, if you fall in the 68th percentile of the sample, you would be inside of here. If you fall in 95% of the sample, you would be out here. Okay, so that's 95% of the numbers are accounted for in this section. 68% of the numbers are accounted for in this section. So that's a little bit of a review and how you can look at standard deviation. They also give the example if I had, they take 7.32 and they double it. And so then it's 14.64. And then they say, well, if a person has 34.15 and they add the 16.64, sorry, the 14.64, that would put them 2 standard deviations above. Or if it's below, it'd be minus 2 standard deviations. So that, I want you to make sure that you comprehend it, read it a couple of times, but then also review the videos that I have provided for you, because this bell curve is something that's talked about quite a bit in educational research. And in fact, it's something that we crunch out all the time, even on standardized tests. It's just sometimes we just put the raw numbers in and something that gets spit back out to us. Percentile rank will be something else that's discussed a little bit further, but it's good to kind of have that basic understanding within this chapter. Okay, a couple of things then for this week. Thought I already had that one open behind there. So here are the objectives. Again, describe the relationship between the constructs, variables, scales, and measures. And of course, you're going to have to know all the other definitions in between to be able to describe those. Define the terms used to describe that numerical data that we see, that statistical data, the numerical data that becomes statistical data when we're looking at research. And really, that's looking at those key words and terms so that when you're reading research, go, yes, I understand what that means. It's like statistics is just a little bit of language. In fact, mathematically, it's not as difficult as, I don't know, geometry, because it really is a lot about the words. The math is not complicated. It's pretty simple mathematical functions, division, multiplication, no derivatives, none of that stuff. But it really is all about the language. My overview right here. But underneath my overview, feel free to browse these YouTube tutorials for statistical concepts. These are the 3 best channels. Khan Academy has concise demonstrations and calculations, and so if you're feeling like, oh, I really just don't get that term, if you go to the Khan Academy web pages and just search for the keyword, maybe it's one of those words that's inside of the glossary for the vocabulary for this week, you're probably going to find a video on that particular statistical term. Now he can go on just a little bit and maybe get a little bit more complicated, but that's the beauty of the video. You can speed it up. It's not like sitting in a lecture. Statistics 101 by Brandon Fultz. And in fact, I have one of his videos down here, Statistics 101, and it's on sampling distributions. You might be looking at this going, holy smokes, that's a lot of videos. But this one, I think, is 18 minutes, but all the other ones are 3 minutes or less. So they're pretty quick. And in fact, that's this last one here, statslectures.com. This individual does really quick, goes over the terms in a very basic way. And in fact, it was really nice that all of those are, in fact, when you go to his channel, if you want to find more on a particular topic, you can. But I've pulled out the important videos for this week that I think maybe need a little bit more explaining beyond your text. So that's some of the resources that you have to learn a little bit more about these descriptive statistics.